I discovered my wife's infidelity when, by accident, my eyes fell on that small mark near her neck. It was an insignificant detail, perhaps for anyone else, but not for me. That brand said more than any words could express. It wasn't just a sign, it was evidence, a trace of an intimate moment that shouldn't have happened. It was at that moment that the ground seemed to crumble beneath my feet, and the air became heavy, difficult to breathe. I remember every detail of that day. The hours leading up to this discovery were ordinary, even banal. A quick breakfast, a hasty kiss goodbye, and she left for work like she did every day. But that mark. It was like a treacherous, unexpected blow that hit my heart directly, shattering everything I believed to be solid and true. I knew something was wrong, but I never could have imagined it would come to this. The small changes in his behavior, the increase in last-minute meetings, the lame excuses that I pretended to believe. It all started to make sense. It wasn't paranoia. It was reality. A bitter, cruel reality that I never wanted to face. The nights when she said she was tired, the forced smiles, the distance that grew between us without me noticing. Every gesture, every word now seemed to be part of a puzzle that I didn't want to put together. But that sign, that unmistakable mark, was there, screaming the truth I feared so much: my wife was no longer just mine. She was torn, and what I was left with was the bitter residue of a relationship that seemed intact only on the surface. The most painful thing, perhaps, was not the confirmation of the betrayal itself, but the understanding that it did not happen overnight. It was a slow process, a series of choices, a secret journey she took without me. And now, as I looked at her without her knowing, I realized that she was no longer the woman I knew, that I loved, and with whom I imagined spending the rest of my life. I didn't know what hurt more, the physical betrayal or the breach of trust. Doubt consumed me. Who was he? How did it start? How long had this been going on? I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, reliving that discovery over and over in my mind, each time with more detail, more pain. But there was something I needed to discover, something that could change everything, or nothing. Curiosity burned in me like an uncontrollable flame, but at the same time, the fear of knowing the complete truth paralyzed me. Was I prepared to face all the details of this betrayal? Could I bear to know the face of him who, in the shadow, took what was mine? And so, without her knowing that I had already discovered her secret, I decided that I would not rest until I found all the answers. Because deep down, I knew this story was far from over. Los Angeles, the city where dreams are born and die just as quickly, was the stage of Richard and Emily Turner's lives. They met at college, where their first years were marked by an intense passion, the kind that consumes the soul and makes time seem insufficient to experience everything you want. The love between them grew, matured, giving way to a comfortable coexistence, where silences were as precious as words. Together, they built a stable life. He, a promising lawyer, was respected for his dedication and ethics. She, a marketing director at a renowned technology company, was admired for her intelligence and ability to deal with crises. Over the years, the relationship between Richard and Emily underwent transformations. The marriage, once filled with moments of passion and spontaneity, gradually became more of a routine than a romance. But that was normal, Richard thought. After all, there is no love that does not change over time. And he was proud to have someone like Emily by his side, an independent, beautiful woman with whom he could share his victories and disappointments. Emily, in turn, felt constant pressure to maintain the facade of perfection. Success at work came at a high cost, and she often found herself lost between her desire to be the perfect wife and the demands of a career that left no room for mistakes. Richard supported her, but there was a growing distance between them, something they both noticed but preferred to ignore. They were together, but at the same time, each lived in their own world. The setting of the Turner home reflected this duality. It was a spacious house in a quiet neighborhood, a refuge from the chaos of the city. The minimalist decor, carefully chosen by Emily, conveyed a superficial calm, an order that contrasted with the emotional disorder that was beginning to take hold in the couple's lives. Photographs of happy times adorned the walls, a constant reminder of simpler times and a love that, at one point, seemed unshakable. Richard loved the house. It was his safe haven, a place where he could relax after a long day of work, immersing himself in his books or watching a game on television. However, lately, he noticed that Emily was spending more and more time outside the house, with justifications that sounded vague. Meetings, business dinners, unexpected trips, all part of what he believed to be the routine of a successful executive. But the truth was that, behind each justification, Emily found herself caught up in a spiral of conflicting emotions. There was the weight of work responsibilities, but also something new, something she didn't know how to deal with. Her relationship with a coworker, Jason, had begun innocently enough, a simple flirtation that she believed she had under control. However, the flirtation turned into something more, something that began to consume her thoughts, causing her to move further and further away from Richard. Jason was everything Richard wasn't: spontaneous, unpredictable, full of a vigor she hadn't seen in her marriage in a long time. Jason was a few years younger than Emily, but he had an engaging personality that made her feel alive again. He made her laugh, brought a freshness she hadn't felt in a long time. What began as casual conversations in the office soon turned into meetings outside of work, dinners that lasted late into the night, and, eventually, an intimacy that Emily knew was dangerous but could not resist. Meanwhile, Richard remained oblivious to the true depth of the situation, although he began to notice small changes in Emily. She was more distant, less interested in the activities they used to share. Her touch, once tender and full of affection, now seemed automatic, almost like an obligation. He tried to justify these changes to himself, saying it was the stress of work, that Emily needed space, but doubt settled in like a poisonous seed, slowly growing. The nights when Emily came home late were the hardest for Richard. He would sit on the couch, with the television on, but not really paying attention. His mind wandered, and he wondered what had changed between them. There was a growing emptiness in his chest, a feeling that he was losing something valuable without knowing how to stop it. But, true to his rational character, he did not want to make accusations without proof. He needed something concrete, something that would confirm or dispel his suspicions. And it was on one of those nights, while Emily was sleeping next to him, that Richard noticed the mark on her neck. A small bruise, almost imperceptible, but for him it was like a warning siren. He knew every inch of that skin, every mark that was already there, and that one was new. His mind began to work frantically, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Why would Emily have a mark like that? And why hadn't she mentioned anything? Richard's uneasiness increased. During breakfast, he tried to observe Emily without appearing suspicious, looking for signs that could corroborate his doubts. She was distracted, as if her mind was elsewhere, and this only intensified his suspicions. He wanted to confront her, ask her directly what was going on, but something inside him stopped him. Fear of the answer, perhaps. The fear that his suspicions were true and that, by questioning her, he was destroying what was left of their relationship once and for all. Emily, on the other hand, felt the tension in the air but couldn't stop. Jason was like a drug, something she knew she needed to give up but couldn't get away from. The messages exchanged on the cell phone, the quick escapes during lunch break, everything contributed to a web of lies that she was weaving without realizing how fragile it was. She didn't want to lose Richard, but at the same time, she felt that she was no longer the same person who had married him. Emily's internal conflict was increasingly evident to herself. The weight of guilt was starting to accumulate, but it still wasn't enough to make her stop. She told herself she could control the situation, that she would know when to stop before things got out of control. But what she didn't know was that Richard was already starting to put the pieces of this puzzle together, and that the end of this story was getting closer and closer to an outcome that neither of them could predict. In the days following that silent discovery, the tension in the Turner household became almost palpable, an invisible current that ran through every conversation, every glance exchanged. Richard felt a growing pressure in his chest, an anguish he didn't know how to ease. The questions that haunted him at night now haunted him during the day, turning ordinary moments into constant reminders that something was terribly wrong. Emily, in turn, seemed increasingly distant, lost in her own thoughts. She was aware that something had changed between them, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It was as if an invisible chasm was slowly opening, separating them, and she didn't know how to stop it from happening. Jason continued to be a constant presence in her life, someone who, despite everything, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. But the guilt was there too, growing like a shadow, always there, always ready to remind her of the choices she was making. In an attempt to keep up appearances, Richard decided to organize a dinner party for some close friends. He wanted to rescue some of the normality that seemed to be slipping out of his hands. Emily agreed, but there was a reluctance in her eyes, as if she knew that tonight could be another piece in a game she wasn't prepared to play. When the guests arrived, the house was filled with laughter and lively conversation, but Richard felt as if he was watching from afar, a spectator in his own life. He watched Emily, who to others seemed perfectly normal, but he could see the little signs he had previously ignored. The way she avoided his gaze for too long, the slight tension in her smile, the brief answers she gave when someone asked about work. There was a disconnect there that he could no longer ignore. At one point in the evening, when the guests were deep in conversation in the living room, Richard saw Emily slip discreetly into the kitchen. He followed her, determined to try to understand what was happening. Her back was to him, fiddling with something on the counter, but he could see that her hands were shaking slightly. He walked closer, trying not to startle her, and placed his hand on her shoulder. Emily turned abruptly, as if she had been caught in the act, her eyes revealing a mix of surprise and something else, fear, perhaps. "Everything is fine?" he asked, voice calmer than he felt inside. Emily nodded quickly but avoided his gaze, refocusing on the task at hand. Richard felt a wave of frustration. He wanted to confront her, demand answers, but something inside him stopped him. It wasn't just fear of the truth, but also uncertainty about what to do with it. The following weeks were a subtle game of lies and suspicion. Richard decided he needed to know more before taking any action. He began to pay more attention to Emily's behavior, mentally noting the times she left the house without a convincing explanation, the excuses she made for her long absences. He knew he needed something more concrete, something to confirm his suspicions. It was then that, on a seemingly ordinary day, Richard decided to make a surprise visit to Emily's office. He claimed he was in the neighborhood for a business lunch and thought he would stop by to take her to lunch. When he arrived, the receptionist greeted him with a smile and informed him that Emily was in a meeting. Richard thanked her, but instead of waiting at reception, he decided to walk down the hall, pretending to admire the photos on the walls. He approached the meeting room and, as he passed through the half-open door, he heard muffled laughter. Curious, he peeked discreetly and saw Emily sitting next to Jason, the coworker who he knew was one of those who had the most contact with her. The two were bent over some papers, but what caught Richard's attention was the way Jason touched Emily's arm, in a way that was anything but professional. Emily laughed softly and, for an instant, her eyes met Jason's, revealing an intimacy that Richard couldn't ignore. He backed away quickly, feeling his heart hammering in his chest. The suspicion that had been gnawing at his thoughts for weeks finally solidified into something tangible. But still, he was not prepared to act. Not there, not then. He needed more. He needed proof. That night, when Emily got home, Richard pretended nothing had happened. They had dinner together, talked about trivial matters, but Richard's mind was racing, formulating a plan. He needed a way to confirm his suspicions without raising alarms. That's when he decided to hire a private detective. A college friend who had pursued a career in private investigation seemed like the perfect person for the job. Discreetly, without arousing suspicion, he could follow Emily, observe her movements, and bring Richard the answers he so desperately wanted. The days that followed were tortuous. Richard knew the detective was following Emily, but he couldn't show anything. Every time she left for work, or for a business meeting, her heart sank, but he maintained the facade of an understanding and distracted husband. And Emily, in turn, continued with her double life, increasingly immersed in a relationship that she knew was dangerous, but that she could not abandon. The detective's report arrived a week later, and with it, a devastating truth. Photos, times, places, everything was there. Emily was having an affair with Jason. It was no longer a suspicion, it was no longer a paranoia. It was reality, naked and raw, printed in images that Richard wished he had never seen. He sat in his home office, exams in front of him, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. What would he do now? Confront her? Pretend nothing had happened? The emotions inside him were a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. But there was something more. A growing need for justice, to make her feel the pain he was feeling. But as he weighed his options, one final question formed in his mind: how, exactly, was he going to do this? Richard knew the confrontation would be inevitable, but he didn't want it to happen anyway. He wanted it to be at the right time, in the right way, so that she understood how much she had destroyed everything they had built together. And, above all, he knew that confrontation was getting closer. Richard spent the next few days in a state of constant tension, his eyes focused on Emily, trying to decipher every gesture, every expression she made. The evidence of his betrayal was there, in front of him, but he hadn't yet decided how to confront it. He wanted that moment to be decisive, for her to understand the impact of his actions, to feel the pain and humiliation he was enduring in silence. Each interaction between them was charged with hidden tension, a kind of silent game in which Richard searched for the perfect moment to reveal what he knew. Emily, in turn, was restless. The guilt for her actions tormented her more and more, but she felt trapped in a cycle that she didn't know how to get out of. Jason was an escape valve, a way to escape the monotony that her life had become, but she knew that this relationship had no future. Every day, she felt the weight of what she was doing increasing, and she began to realize that she was losing control of the situation. It was on a Friday night, when Emily arrived late from work, that Richard decided the time had come. She entered the silent house, feeling tired in her legs and mind, just wanting to take a hot shower and erase the day's events from her memory. But when she entered the room, she found Richard sitting in the armchair, his eyes fixed on her in a way she had never seen before. "We need to talk," he said, in a voice that brooked no question. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew this moment would come eventually, but she wasn't prepared for it. Richard stood up slowly, as if every movement was calculated. He went to the table next to the armchair and picked up a thick envelope, which he had left there in plain sight. Without a word, he handed the envelope to Emily, who hesitated for a second before taking it. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the envelope and pulled out the contents: photos, detailed reports, everything documenting her outings, her encounters with Jason, the betrayal she tried so hard to hide. The blood drained from Emily's face. She looked at the photos, each one a cruel blow to her conscience, but said nothing. His heart was beating uncontrollably, but his mind was blank, unable to formulate any response. She knew there were no excuses, no lies that could erase that evidence. "How long has this been going on?" Richard asked, his voice low but filled with contained anger. Emily looked up at him, her lips quivering slightly. "Richard, I don't know what to say." She began, but the words got tangled in her throat. She wanted to find a way to justify her actions, to explain that it had been a mistake, that she never intended to hurt him, but each attempt seemed empty, meaningless. "Don't know what to say. Or don't know how to lie anymore." Richard's voice rose, the calm he had maintained until that moment beginning to break. "I trusted you, Emily. I built a life with you. And you betrayed me in every way possible." "It's not that simple," Emily tried to argue, but the words sounded weak, devoid of conviction. She knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. I never wanted to hurt you, Richard. I was lost. Jason was just a distraction. A distraction? Richard repeated, almost in an incredulous whisper. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to contain the fury that threatened to boil over. A distraction is something you do for a few minutes. It's not an extramarital affair that lasts weeks, months. That destroys everything we've built together. Emily tried to reach for his hand, but Richard pulled back, as if her touch burned him. I just wanted to feel something different. I felt suffocated, lost in a routine I couldn't stand anymore. Jason, he was new, exciting. But that never meant I didn't love you. Richard let out a bitter laugh. Love? You call that love? Emily, that's the opposite of love. What you did was destroy any trace of trust between us. You didn't think about me, you didn't think about us. You only thought about yourself. Emily lowered her head, tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to say she was sorry, that she would do anything to fix what she had broken, but she knew words wouldn't be enough. Not this time. I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. Are you sorry? You're sorry about getting caught, maybe. Richard was now just a few steps away from her, his eyes fixed on hers, daring her to find some defense for the indefensible. But you never would have stopped, would you? You would have continued to deceive me, to live this lie, while pretending we were still a couple. Emily couldn't respond. His mind was in chaos, each thought more confusing than the last. She knew Richard was right, that any words she said now would be empty. But she also knew she wasn't ready to lose everything. Not yet. Richard, please. Let me explain. I was confused, I didn't want this to happen. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake, but we can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes so you can trust me, again. Trust you? Richard shook his head in disbelief. How can I trust someone who lied to me, who betrayed my feelings, who threw away our marriage like it was nothing? Emily, you destroyed everything. There's no fix for this. Emily felt like the ground was opening up beneath her feet. Tears were now flowing freely down his face, but Richard seemed immune to his suffering. I don't want to lose you. Please give me a chance to make things right. Richard watched her in silence for a moment, his expression hardened. He had waited so long for this moment, for this confession, but now that he had it, he only felt empty. I don't know if I can, he said finally, his voice breaking. You betrayed me in a way I never imagined possible. And even if I wanted to, I don't know if I can forgive you. Emily fell to her knees, sobs racking her body. Richard, please. I love you. Don't leave me. Richard looked at her, the woman he had loved for so many years, now reduced to a portrait of despair. Part of him wanted to give in, wanted to believe that their love could overcome anything. But the pain he felt, the betrayal that had consumed him, was a weight he didn't know if he could carry. I need time, he said finally, his voice dark. I need to think about what this means for us. If there is still a us. Emily remained on the floor, unable to move, as Richard walked away, leaving her alone with her guilt and remorse. She knew the damage had been done, that anything she said now would just be a desperate attempt to hold on to something that might already be lost forever. Richard climbed the stairs slowly, each step an effort to contain the avalanche of emotions that threatened to crash over him. He closed the bedroom door behind him, the noise echoing through the silent house, and finally allowed the tears to fall. He knew his life would never be the same, and the decision he needed to make was one of the hardest he had ever faced. The night was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions for Richard. As he lay in bed, the day's events replayed in his mind like an inescapable movie, each scene bringing to the surface the pain and anger he tried to suppress. He couldn't find peace, couldn't stop thinking about what he had lost. His mind kept returning to Emily's words, trying to find some truth, some reason for what she had done. But all he found was emptiness. Meanwhile, Emily remained in the room, her knees still on the floor, her mind drowning in guilt and regret. She knew she had destroyed the most precious thing she had, and the thought of losing Richard terrified her. But she also knew that things would never be the same no matter how hard she tried. The betrayal was there, between them, like an invisible wall that separated them, that perhaps could never be torn down. The next day, Richard left home early without saying a word. He needed air, space, time to process everything that had happened. He walked aimlessly through the streets, his mind in chaos, trying to find a way to deal with the situation. He knew he needed to make a decision, but he didn't know where to start. The love he felt for Emily was still there, buried beneath the pain and anger, but he didn't know if that would be enough to overcome what she had done. As he walked, Richard began to think about all the promises they had made to each other, all the times they swore to be together no matter what. And now, it all seemed like a lie. He wondered if he would ever be able to look at Emily without feeling the pain of betrayal, if he would ever be able to trust her again. Hours later, he returned home. Emily was sitting on the couch, her eyes swollen from crying, but she got up as soon as she saw him enter. "Richard, she began, but he interrupted her with a gesture. "I need to talk," he said, voice firm. "I've been thinking about everything that happened, everything you've done, and everything you mean to us. And the truth is, I don't know if I can go on like this." Emily was silent, her heart beating fast. She knew he was right, that the situation they found themselves in was not sustainable. "I understand," she finally replied, her voice low. "I know what I did was unforgivable. But please, Richard, give me a chance. I know I can earn your trust back, I know we can get through this together." Richard looked at her, and for a moment, all he saw was the woman he had loved for so many years, the one who had been by his side through every important moment in his life. But then, the memory of the betrayal came back, and he felt the anger bubbling up inside him again. "Get through this together. Emily, you broke something that may never be fixed. I don't know if I have the strength to try." Emily took a step forward, her hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication. "Please, Richard, I love you. I can't lose you. I'm willing to do anything to make you forgive me." Richard stood still for a long moment, her words echoing in his mind. He wanted to believe, he wanted to forgive her, but something kept him from giving in completely. "I need time," he said finally. "I need time to understand if we can still be us." Emily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I understand. And I will wait, Richard. I will wait as long as it takes, because I know you are the man of my life." The days that followed were a test of emotional endurance for both of them. Richard decided to step away for a while, needing distance to think clearly. He went to a friend's house, where he could reflect on his life, on what he really wanted for the future. Emily, on the other hand, was left alone in the house that had once been a home, every corner now a painful reminder of what she had lost. Time passed slowly. Richard tried to focus on other things, but his mind always returned to Emily, to the life they had built together, and to the betrayal that had destroyed everything. He talked to friends, to family, trying to find some clarity, but the answers weren't coming. He knew that love didn't disappear overnight, but he also knew that he couldn't live with the specter of distrust haunting his every moment. Finally, after weeks of introspection, Richard made a decision. He knew that the love he felt for Emily was still there, but he also knew that the scars of betrayal wouldn't disappear easily. He returned home, determined to confront the future that now unfolded before them. When he entered the house, he found Emily in the kitchen, preparing dinner as she did every night. She looked at him, surprised, and for a moment, there was an expectant silence. Richard took a deep breath, gathering the courage he needed to speak. "Emily, I've thought a lot about everything that happened," he began, his voice calm but firm. "And I've come to a conclusion. I love you, but I can't just forget what you did. I can't live in a relationship where trust has been broken so irreparably." Emily placed the knife on the counter, her heart racing. She knew this moment would come, but she wasn't prepared to hear it. "What do you mean?" she asked, voice wavering. "I want to say that I need time, maybe a lot of time, to understand if I can forgive you. Maybe one day, we can rebuild something. But for now, I need to walk away, I need to live my life without the shadow of what happened between us." Emily felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. The tears began to fall again, but she knew that this time, nothing could change Richard's decision. "I understand," she said, almost in a whisper. "And as much as it pains me, I respect your decision." Richard nodded slowly. "That doesn't mean I can never forgive you, Emily. But I need this time, for both of us." He turned, walking towards the door, feeling the weight of each step. Emily stood back, watching him leave, knowing that this was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, a chapter full of uncertainty, but also possibility. The days that followed Richard's decision were marked by a dense, almost oppressive silence that enveloped both protagonists of this story. For Richard, withdrawal was a desperate attempt to find clarity amid the whirlwind of conflicting emotions that were plaguing him. He knew his love for Emily hadn't disappeared, but it was buried beneath layers of pain, mistrust, and a bitter sense of betrayal that he couldn't just erase. During this time, Richard fell into thought, pondering the complexities of his situation. He was trapped in a moral dilemma that seemed to have no solution. On the one hand, there was the part of him that still wanted to believe Emily, that wanted to forgive her and rebuild the life they had lost. But on the other hand, there was the deep wound opened by betrayal, something he knew he would never be able to completely forget. As he reflected, Richard found himself confronted with questions he never imagined he would have to consider. Could a relationship survive such a devastating betrayal? Was it possible to rebuild trust when it had been so completely destroyed? And, most importantly, would he be willing to live with the constant shadow of doubt, always questioning whether Emily would be faithful from now on? These questions haunted him day and night, leading him to a state of emotional exhaustion. He isolated himself, distancing himself not only from Emily but also from worried friends and family who tried to offer support. Richard felt this was a journey he needed to take alone, an internal process of acceptance and decision. Meanwhile, Emily was in an emotional prison of her own. Alone in the house that had once been a welcoming home, she now lived surrounded by the ghosts of her choices. Every corner of the house, every object, brought back memories of the happy moments she had shared with Richard, making her loneliness even more unbearable. She knew she had made a terrible mistake, but the regret she felt was insufficient to change the reality she had created. Emily also faced her own moral dilemma. She knew she had ruined Richard's trust and that even if he forgave her one day, things would never be the same. But what tormented her most was the idea that perhaps their love wasn't strong enough to overcome this ordeal. She wondered if she deserved a second chance, if she should fight for her marriage or accept that she had lost Richard forever. Time seemed to pass differently for both of them. Weeks turned into months, and throughout that period, communication between them was minimal. Richard had not yet returned home, preferring to continue his search for answers, while Emily tried to find a way to move forward, even without knowing what the next step would be. One day, Richard decided he needed to see Emily. He wasn't ready to make a final decision, but he felt it was time for an honest conversation, something they had both been avoiding. He called her, his voice serious but not hostile, asking them to meet at a cafe they used to frequent years ago, when they were still dating. Emily accepted the invitation, although her heart was heavy with uncertainty. On the appointed day, she arrived at the cafe early, sitting at a table in the corner, away from the hustle and bustle of other people. When Richard arrived, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, it was as if time had turned back. They sat in silence, each absorbing the other's presence, trying to gauge how much had changed since the last time they were together. "I needed to see you," Richard began, breaking the silence. "I needed to talk to you without the pressure of making an immediate decision. I feel like we're at a point where we can't delay this conversation any longer." Emily nodded, eyes fixed on the cup of coffee in front of her. "I understand. I also feel like we need to talk. I'm sorry about everything, Richard. Not a day goes by that I don't think about what I did and how much I hurt you. Richard sighed, looking out the window for a moment before responding. I know, Emily. And I believe you're sorry. But what we've done from here is not simple. It's not just about forgiving or forgetting. It's about how we deal with the reality of what happened, how we may or may not rebuild something from this. Emily looked up at him, her feelings on the surface. I know it's hard, maybe even impossible. But I'm willing to try, if you are too. I know I need to win back your trust, but I believe our love is still here, even if it's buried beneath all this pain. Richard was silent for a long time, her words echoing in his mind. He knew the love was still there, but the question was whether that love was strong enough to bear the weight of what they had been through. He also knew that whatever his decision was, it would have a profound impact on both of them, changing their lives forever. I can't promise things will be the same as before, Richard said finally, his voice thick with honesty. But I'm willing to explore that possibility. I don't want to make a hasty decision, but I think we should see where it takes us. Emily felt a small hope rise within her, but she knew the path ahead would be difficult and uncertain. She nodded, trying to control the emotion in her voice. I appreciate that, Richard. And I will do whatever it takes to earn back your trust, one day at a time. They continued talking, their words filled with a new sincerity, a genuine attempt to understand how they could move forward. There were no guarantees, no empty promises, just an acknowledgement that they both still had feelings for each other and that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to heal the wounds they had inflicted on each other. As they left the cafe, the feeling of resolution was not complete, but there was a lightness in the air, a small spark of hope that, even in the face of devastation, something new could emerge. The future was uncertain, but it was clear that they were not willing to give up so easily. They both knew that the real challenge was just beginning. The months that followed the coffee conversation were a test for both of them. Richard and Emily tried to get back together, but the shadow of what had happened hung over them, a constant presence that they couldn't ignore. Attempts at normality were interrupted by uncomfortable silences, furtive glances, and the feeling that, despite the effort, something crucial had been lost forever. Richard was fighting his own demons. He wanted to believe it was possible to overcome betrayal, but Emily's every gesture, every word, was a painful reminder of the past. He found himself questioning her every step, every exit, every call. What was supposed to be a new beginning was becoming a cycle of distrust and bitterness. Richard knew that, despite all his effort, he couldn't leave the past behind. And this inability was destroying him from within. Emily, on the other hand, was desperate to prove that she had changed. She knew their love was no longer the same, but she believed there was still something to be saved. She dedicated herself to the relationship with an almost obsessive intensity, trying to make up for the mistakes she had made. But as the days passed, the reality became clear: unilateral effort would not be enough to restore what had been broken. It was on a cold autumn night that everything reached breaking point. Richard had arrived home late after another long day at work. He felt exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. Every day felt like a losing battle, and he knew it couldn't go on like this much longer. Emily was waiting for him in the living room, her eyes filled with silent expectation, as if waiting for some confirmation that everything would be okay. "We need to talk, Emily," he said, his voice filled with a resolve he hadn't felt in a long time. She looked at him, feeling her heart race, but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I've thought a lot about us, about everything that's happened, and I've come to a conclusion," Richard continued, sitting down in the armchair across from her. "As much as I've tried, as much as we've both tried, the truth is that I can't go on like this." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She knew what was coming, but hearing Richard's words still hit her like a blow. "Richard, please don't make this hot-headed decision. We can still try." He shook his head slowly, a sad look in his eyes. "It's not a matter of trying anymore, Emily. It's a matter of accepting reality. I've realized that, as much as I want to, I can't forgive you completely. And living with this distrust, with this pain, is not living. We both deserve better than that. You deserve more than someone who can never look at you the same. Emily felt tears running down her face, but she didn't try to stop him. She knew he was right, but that didn't make the pain any less intense. I love you, Richard, she said, her voice breaking. I will always love you. Richard nodded, tears now in his own eyes. And I'll love you too, Emily. But sometimes, love isn't enough to get over what happened. I need peace, and I think you do too. Maybe, apart, we can find what we're looking for. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with silent mourning for what they had lost. Richard got up and, with one last look, walked out the door, leaving Emily alone in the room. She knew that this was the end, the true end, and that from that moment on, their lives would take different directions. The next few days were a blur of painful formalities. They divided their assets, signed divorce papers, and finally separated. Richard moved to another city, looking for a fresh start, something that could give him the peace he craved. He knew the scar from that betrayal would never completely disappear, but over time, it became a part of who he was, a painful lesson in trust and loss. Emily remained in the house, but she was never the same. Loneliness was now his constant companion, and every corner of the house seemed to echo with memories of what once was. She tried to move on, to find new reasons to live, but the shadow of her past choices never left her. The love she felt for Richard was still there, but it was mixed with regret and a deep sadness for everything she had lost. As time passed, they both followed different paths. Richard has found a new life, a new peace, far from the memories of his failed marriage. He finally found what he was looking for, a tranquility that, although lonely, gave him the freedom to live without the weight of the past. Emily, for her part, remained trapped in her own regrets, unable to find the redemption she so desperately wanted. And so, Richard and Emily's story ended, not with a grand gesture of reconciliation, but with the harsh reality that not all love can survive the impact of betrayal. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go.